Former Alberta Premier Jason Kenney is going to court. On Thursday, an Alberta judge found that basically dismissed the former Alberta Premier's motion to dismiss a defamation suit that was brought by 5 environmental groups. And it was over the public inquiry into anti-Alberta energy campaigns. A long story, which we'll get to later on in the interview. But I'm going to talk to Tim Gray, who's the Executive Director of Environmental Defence and one of Defence Canada, and one of the groups that is part of the suit, and get his take on what exactly they're trying to do and what happened on Thursday. So welcome to the interview, Tim.
Thanks for having me.
Look, as I understand it, Jason Kenney spent a couple of years on social media, and frankly, I had a front seat to all of this because I saw many of his tweets that allegedly slandered you and the other members or the other folks in the lawsuit. What I don't understand is when he made these comments, you're the Premier of the Alberta. You can say them in the legislature and have parliamentary privilege and be protected from saying them, and yet he felt no compunction about saying these things in a public forum.
That's true. He did repeatedly. And then, after the inquiry was completed, and I think the Steve Allen and who was the commissioner and the report itself was very careful, and concluded that environmental organizations had been basically doing their job, which is to point out the risks of industrial activity, in particular oil and gas, and what expansion of that industry would mean for Canada's ability to meet its climate targets, and also the other consequences of untreated tailings, abandoned oil wells, all the rest of the things that we routinely talk about. It was very clear that Steve Allen, didn't like the fact that we talked about it. But the whole accusation that the Premier was making repeatedly for years, and including when he launched the inquiry, was that somehow we were spreading misinformation. We were tricking people into thinking the oil industry was bad and doing these horrible things. And of course, after millions of dollars and years of work, the Allen inquiry found that, well, actually what they're saying is pretty much true, and they're just doing their jobs to point it out as public interest organizations. But of course, the Premier didn't like that outcome. He'd paid for something different, and he decided that he would just redefine the outcome to fit his narrative, and continued to say that we had spread misinformation, and in particular, and this is the focus of our legal action, said that the inquiry itself had concluded that we had spread misinformation, when of course it concluded exactly the opposite. So that to us, and we're hoping to a court, means that he was intentionally trying to defame us. And so that's why we decided to pursue the legal action.
The other groups that are part of this action are West Coast Environmental Law, Dogwood Initiative, Stand.Earth, and the Wilderness Committee. And so what happened on Thursday? My understanding is that, I think it's standard in cases like this that the defense puts forward a motion to dismiss, and that's what happened, and the judge said no, and now it goes to trial. Is that correct?
That's absolutely the case, yes.
So do we know when it'll go to trial?
No, I wish we did. It would make predicting like what to do next a little easier. It all has to do with what the scheduling is within the court system, and there's apparently no really way to know, but we're hoping that it's all going to wrap up within the next year.
Well, okay, so that's the basics. Premier Kenney is going to be on trial. Now, I'm sure that you've had a chat with your lawyers, and the other groups have had a chat with their lawyers. And are you looking forward to discovery with the Alberta government and former Premier Kenney?
We are, because, in our view, there must have been significant internal correspondence around how to deal with the fact that the inquiry found that we, in fact, just been doing our job and had not been spreading misinformation. And we're very curious to see how the premier's communication ended up saying exactly the opposite, and what kind of deliberations occurred in the lead up to that. So that'll be very valuable, I think, insight into the workings of the premier and the Alberta government at that time.
Now, I want to point out for our viewers that the premier called this public inquiry, and that's a very serious thing. And if you want to go on our YouTube channel, on Energy Media's YouTube channel, you can search for Kangaroo Court. Is in that those two words were in the headline in an interview I did with Professor Martin Olashinsky, who's a law prof at the University of Calgary, and he's an expert in the Alberta Public Inquiry Act. And this is very serious. The commissioner is able, or was able, to call witnesses, to subpoena witnesses, and there are very strict rules around how the inquiry has to proceed, how it handles evidence. It can't be a kangaroo court because there are very strict rules about this. Now, is that the case, Tim?
Well, there should be. I mean, we have separate concerns about the calling of the inquiry, the fact that it was so politically motivated, that it clearly the premier had a foregone conclusion that he wanted to reach, which became evident after it didn't get the conclusions that he wanted. But as you mentioned, it should be relying on evidence. It should be calling expert witnesses. It should be calling witness statements from people that are being investigated. And of course, those things didn't happen. I never talked to Steve Allen the entire time the inquiry was going on. So I think Kangaroo Court was a very apt description of what was actually going on with that inquiry.
Well, fair enough. And I want to make a point here that in the report, it was almost a tale of two reports, because on the one hand, there was the first part of the report was, I'm sure, written by lawyers, and it made sure to cover all of the legal bases, not give you grounds to sue Allen or anyone else. It was very careful, and it did exonerate you. And the amount of money that was supposedly going to these foreign funded environmental groups in the tar sands campaign really turned out to be about $3 million a year. Was a fraction of the money that the premier and others claimed was being spent on opposing the oil sands. But the second part actually had a lot of really inflammatory language in it, and the inquiry commissioned at least 3 reports that there were a couple of PhDs that did them that I can remember, Barry Cooper being one, that talked about Marxism and communism and environmental groups being in that camp, and global cloak and dagger conspiracy theories. It was really wild stuff, and it was a very odd report. Would you agree or disagree?
Yes, it was very odd, and some of the reports that you mentioned that were commissioned were laughable in their simplicity and a repetition of, I don't know, Facebook and Twitter conspiracy theories. I kept looking for some kind of repetition of like George Soros's name or something. I mean, it was really out there, and it was really shocking to see that Albertans were being forced to pay for this kind of crap that was being produced by the inquiry. So it's too bad.
Well, this is where we get to the part about why the inquiry was called in the first place. And Energy Media actually played a small role in this, because the premier and the oil and gas industry have promoted the work of Vivian Krause, who's a Vancouver blogger. And she, far back as like 2011, I think, 2012, she had been promoting this idea that American foundations were sending huge amounts of money into Canada to fund opposition to pipelines and the oil sands and what have you. And she got part of it right. I mean, that is true. There were foundations, and I did a 9,000-word investigative report on this in May of 2018. I talked to people like Zipporah Berman, who were managing that campaign, and she said, look, it was $40 million over 10 years. That's what we got. and we gave it out to every year. Between 50 and 100 groups got this money, and so it wasn't, George Soros was nowhere to be found. These were very
No.
these were very there was the Hewlett Foundation. It was Hewlett or Packard, I can't remember. It was one of those two. But anyway, these were very, very well-respected American foundations that were doing this. And then after Rachel Notley and the NDP government introduced the Climate Leadership Plan in 2015, it all dried up because Zipporah told me that essentially the foundations told her that all they wanted was Alberta to adopt climate policy. So once they had climate policy, then the money, the money flowed to a trickle. So the irony here is that 4 years before the inquiry was called and 6 years before the report appeared, essentially the thing they were investigating had stopped. I mean, it's almost farce, Tim.
Well, it is high farce. And, of course, Vivian Krause also had another little piece to her narrative, which is that the reason we were doing this was not actually to do anything about climate, but it was actually to further the competitiveness position of American oil companies. So supposedly I was doing this, I was getting out of bed every day to help ExxonMobil, have more market share, even though they own Imperial. So in Canada, anyway, none of it made any sense. But that was her narrative. I confronted her a couple of times. Once in Toronto, and when she was giving a talk, and it's just saying, like, why do you keep telling this lie, Vivian? Like, why are you, like, what's in this for you? Why are you doing this? And I, of course, never got an answer. But yeah, it was, I suppose, it made a convenient narrative for the premier and for the oil industry, who backs this kind of stuff. But of course, it's all fiction.
Well, indeed, and I have to say to viewers that at Energy Media here, we work on oil and gas political narrative for years. And one of the things that the industry does, and it doesn't do this just in Canada, it does this in the US and globally, but it's very, very good, and it pours a tremendous amount of resources into managing narrative, press releases and events and all sorts of ways to influence public opinion. And one of the main narrative in Alberta, I think you could call it ethical oil. It's after Ezra Levant's 2010 book, where Alberta oil, Canadian oil, is more ethical than oil from Nigeria or Saudi Arabia because we're a democracy. And then that got expanded to we're the most environmentally responsible produced oil in the world, to we have the world-class, the best in world-class regulatory regime. And that has sort of grown like Topsy over the years into this thing that Kenney was trying to harness for his own political purpose, and did very well in 2019 with it, by the way. And for viewers who aren't aware, we just published about 3 weeks ago the part 1 of an investigative report called Alberta Unethical Oil, Alberta's Secret Shame. And we finally got back behind what's going on in the claims around ethical oil. And it is not at all what is claimed. Let me put it that way. You can read it. You can go to the energy.media website, and you can find it there's unethical oil up on the nav bar. But I think, Tim, that at the end of the day, is my opinion, that what the premier was doing, and he's not alone. I mean, there were all kinds of oil and gas executives and trade associations doing similar things, but it was all about keeping that, feeding that narrative mill that Alberta is a victim of foreign influence, and the virtuous domestic industry is under attack. Would you agree or disagree?
Yeah, that was the narrative they were trying to create. That was their I guess they'd sat down and figured out that was a good message track for them in order to build support, etc. Of course, Alberta oil is not particularly ethical, nor is any oil. I mean, you've got waste, you've got carbon emissions, and all the rest of that stuff. I think though the real cost to this is a distraction from actually getting in front of the energy transition. And for Albertans, the continued being continuously subject to this propaganda and gaslighting by industry and by politicians who are doing their bidding just means that the province continues to put off reckoning with the future that's coming. And there will be an energy transition. And if there's not, then our civilization isn't going to survive. And I do think people want to get in front of that. They'd like to have a future. The signs of transition mount week by week in terms of adoption of renewable energy and electric vehicles and you name it. But the tipping point in fossil fuel demand is coming very, very soon. And every year the predictions about when it's going to come kind of move forward towards the present. And in that world, Alberta's not particularly well poised with more expensive oil than the global average. And therefore, we need to be thinking about that transition and distracting people with this idea that the only problems that Alberta has is that super well-funded environmentalists like my massive organizations with its 40 staff, are somehow taking on the poor, weakling oil industry and driving it to submission. That's a nice narrative to sell, I suppose, to to a willing public to receive it. But it's a huge disservice to Albertans and Canadians to distract them from the real challenge of figuring out what to do next as fossil fuels necessarily decline and are replaced by cleaner energy.
Well, Tim, I'm going to close this interview with just a comment on that, because again, this is something that a lot of the work that we do around energy media addresses the issue that you raised. So what's the purpose of this? Right now, especially for the oil sands companies, which dominate the industry, the status quo is extraordinarily profitable. I mean, they made, I forget the number just offhand, but 2022 was incredibly profitable, tens and tens and tens and tens of billions of dollars in profit. And going forward, at least for a few years, and they think it's going to be many more years. So they don't want things to change. They don't want to spend money to adapt, because they believe, kind of with Vaclav Smil, that energy transitions will take a long time, and this one's going to take a long time. And people like you, Tim, are out of touch. You're hyping it, that sort of thing. So they use, in part, this narrative to kind of keep the regulators at bay, to keep the politicians at bay, to keep the federal government at bay with its emissions regulations. And that, I think, is the primary purpose of all of this narrative, all of this noise and that's going on. At the bottom of it, it's we don't want to change any more than we have to. So, Tim, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much.